She was not born monstrous. There were no fangs, no scales, no serpents slithering across her head. There was only a young woman who breathed in the temple incense and believed that purity was a shield. The marble beneath her feet was cold, but the world was still simple. She did not know that the gods mistake beauty for defiance. Her face was spoken of in whispers. Pilgrims averted their eyes, but too late. There was something about her that made the temple's silence seem smaller. And when a sea god turned his gaze upon that figure kneeling before the altar, fate ceased to be a line and became a blade. That night the temple did not echo with chants. It echoed with ragged breathing. It echoed with stifled pleas. It echoed with the sound of something breaking. Not stone, not wood, but trust. The sacred ground, dedicated to wisdom, bore witness to an act that would never be punished as it should have been. But the justice of the gods doesn't weigh guilt, it weighs pride. And when the goddess of war and reason saw her temple defiled, her fury did not find the sea, did not find the trident. It found the young woman. It found the devotee. It found the most fragile part of the equation. The next morning, when she touched her own head, she felt movement. It was not the wind, nor strands of hair. There were cold bodies coiling around. When her eyes met a man's eyes for the last time, the scream was not hers, it was his. And the world discovered that sometimes the monster is born from injustice. The story that has crossed the centuries speaks of a creature that turned men to stone. It speaks of a severed head used as a weapon. It speaks of a hero who defeated terror, but it rarely begins where it should begin, before the curse, before the disfigurement, before the fear. Today we will explore the version told by Ovid, in which Medusa does not appear as a monster, but as a priestess of Athena. We will walk through the temple before its desecration. We will listen to the sea before Poseidon's invasion, and we will witness the moment when a goddess chooses to protect her own pride instead of her own servant. This is not a comfortable narrative, nor is it meant to absolve gods or soften divine decisions. It is meant to observe the exact moment when power and justice cease to be the same thing. If you like mythology told without embellishment, subscribe now. Like this video so that more people can discover the stories that books have oversimplified. This channel is for those who prefer the version that echoes in the dark. And tell me in the comments, from which country and city are you watching? I want to know how far this story will spread, because today we're not going to talk about a creature. We're going to talk about a divine sentence. The temple rose like a white blade against the sky of Hellas. Doric columns supported not only stone but silence. Inside, every sound was absorbed before it could become an echo. The air carried the scent of burnt oil in crushed leaves. It was a space made for discipline, not for desire. Medusa walked barefoot across the polished marble. Her steps were restrained, measured, almost invisible. From a very young age, she had been consecrated to the service of Athena. There was no choice. There was honour. Her life would be the honor. Her body would be the vow. Her existence would be vigilance. The rituals began before the sun touched the horizon. She wiped the invisible dust from the altar as if cleansing impure thoughts from her own spirit. She changed the offerings with steady arms. She repeated prayers that asked for wisdom, strategy, restraint. The goddess she served was not made of indulgence, but of order. And yet, there was something about her that broke the symmetry of the temple. Her hair fell in thick waves, shining like freshly forged metal. The skin reflected the light in an almost offensive way. Pilgrims came seeking divine counsel, but left remarking on the priestess's beauty. She noticed the glances. She was not naive. She knew when reverence turned into desire, but believed that the sacred made her untouchable, that the temple walls were ramparts against any impure intention. That serving the goddess of wisdom was protection enough. Athena demanded absolute chastity from her priestesses, not out of fragility, but for the sake of control. The mind should be a sharpened blade, not a scattered flame. Medusa accepted this burden with conviction. She took pride in her own discipline. She took pride in belonging to the goddess who was born armed. But beauty in the world of the gods is never neutral. Beauty is a provocation. Beauty is unsolicited power. And power arouses interest. Far beyond the columns, beyond solid ground, the sea breathed. The waves crashed with relentless force, as if something ancient were testing the limits of the shore. Poseidon was not silence, he was impact, violent foam against the rock. He was the kind of deity who does not contemplate, he takes. They say it was upon seeing her during a procession that the god of the sea made up his mind. There was no courtship, no request, only a decision. And when a god decides, the consequence is already set in motion before any mortal realizes. That afternoon, the wind blew differently between the temple columns. The flames of the oil lamps flickered for no apparent reason. Medusa lifted her eyes for a moment, sensing something she could not name. It was not fear, not yet. It was the feeling that the sanctuary had begun to watch back. Night fell without spectacle. No storm announced what was to come. The sky remained clear, almost indifferent. Inside the temple, the oil lamps cast long shadows between the columns, turning the architecture into something more organic, almost alive. Medusa was alone when she heard the first sound. It was not a human footstep, nor the cautious shuffling of late pilgrims. It was a damp, heavy sound, like water displacing space where there should be no water. The air changed, becoming dense. The scent of salt invaded the dry marble. She turned around slowly. Her heart did not race at first, because there was not yet understanding, only strangeness. And then he was there. Not as a myth, not as a symbol, but as an overwhelming presence. Poseidon had crossed the threshold of the temple without asking permission. His eyes were not contemplative, they were possessive. The trident was not raised, but it did not need to be. His authority came from his very existence. The god of the sea does not bow before stone, even if that stone belongs to Athena. Medusa took a step back, not out of insolence, but by instinct. The temple had always been a place of order, not a confrontation. Her voice tried to find firmness. She reminded him that this was sacred ground, that this space was protected by the goddess of strategy and war. Poseidon smiled as the sea smiles before it drowns. There was no discussion, no agreement. There was only approach. And when he advanced, the ground did not tremble. It was the silence that broke. The columns watched, the statues watched, the altar watched. What happened there was not a storm, it was an invasion. It was not passion, it was domination. The temple, which had always been a symbol of wisdom, became a stage for humiliation. The sound that echoed was not a battle cry, it was something lower, more restrained, harder to bear. When everything ceased, there was no apology, no immediate consequence. Poseidon simply withdrew, like the tide receding after destroying what was on the shore. He left behind the smell of salt, ragged breathing, and an altar that no longer seemed sacred. Medusa remained kneeling for a time she couldn't measure. The temple seemed smaller. The air felt far too heavy for her lungs. She did not cry. There was something harder than tears forming inside her, a sense of irreversible rupture. Outside, the sea kept crashing against the rocks, as if nothing had happened. But inside Athena's temple, something had been desecrated. And when the goddess realized, the punishment would not fall upon the ocean. Morning brought no relief, only exposure. Sunlight pierced through the temple columns and revealed what the night had tried to hide. The altar was untouched, the lamps still smouldered, the marble remained smooth, but the sacred had been violated, and gods notice when their authority is challenged. Athena was not made of impulses like the sea. She was made of calculation, a daughter born from the head of Zeus. Armed and clear-minded, she did not tolerate disorder. Her temple was not just a building, it was an extension of her identity. When her presence filled the space, there was no thunder nor earthquake. There was absolute silence, a silence so dense it seemed to push the air from one's lungs. Medusa felt it before she saw it. A chill ran down her spine like a blade. She slowly lifted her eyes. There was no challenge there, only something that resembled shame, but was not guilt. It was the awareness of having been turned into the centre of a conflict she had never provoked. Athena walked up to the antler. Her eyes scanned every inch of the temple. They were not searching for truth, but for offence. The scent of salt still lingered in the air. The goddess recognized her rival's signature. Poseidon had not only invaded the temple, he had left his mark. But to confront the god of the sea would mean open war between forces already vying for territory. Athena was not driven by naivety, but by strategy. And strategy, at times, chooses the weakest target. Her gaze then fell upon the priestess, upon the hair that had drawn comments, upon the face that had diverted attention, even within the temple itself. Beauty was no longer a gift, but an affront. Medusa tried to speak. The words would not take shape. How could one explain violence to a goddess who had not witnessed the moment? How could one ask for justice when justice itself wears a helmet and wields a spear? Athena raised her hand, not to touch but to condemn. There was no long speech, no interrogation. There was a decision. If the temple had been desecrated, something would have to bear the eternal mark of that desecration. And in that moment, the punishment was not directed at the sea, nor was it cast against the trident. It was focused on the flesh of the kneeling young woman, because sometimes, in order to preserve their own authority, the gods choose to turn victims into symbols. The condemnation did not come as an explosion, but as a silent invasion. First, a sharp heat on her scalp, as if roots were being torn out from the inside. Medusa instinctively brought her hands to her head, expecting to feel ordinary human pain. What she found was movement. The strands that once flowed like gold began to harden between her fingers. They did not break, nor did they fall, they writhed. Each lock gained its own weight, its own will. The texture changed. From silk, it became scale. From perfume, it became a raw metallic smell. She tried to scream, but the sound came out distorted, as if her own throat found the body it inhabited strange. Beneath her feet, the marble seemed to recoil. The transformation was not only external. Something inside her was also being rewritten. Athena watched without hesitation. There was no obvious pleasure on her face. There was purpose. The beauty that had once drawn gazes would be replaced by repulsion. What once invited closeness would now impose eternal distance. Medusa's eyes burned. A pressure grew behind her eyelids, as if her very gaze were being sharpened. When she finally lifted her face, a priestess who had remained at the entrance of the temple ran towards her. Eye contact lasted a second, just one, enough for the other woman's skin to turn opaque. A movement stopped mid-step. Her breath caught in the air. Her flesh hardened like newly formed rock. The sound of petrification was not explosive, but dry, a low, final crack. Before her, where once there had been life, there was now a statue, not sculpted by an artist, but frozen by a curse. Medusa staggered backwards. Each movement of the new serpents produced a harsh whisper, like leaves scraping over stone. They were not ornaments, but extensions, part of her, living witnesses to the sentence. When she tried to avoid her own reflection in a polished blade from the temple, she saw what remained. Her face was still recognizable, but there was something primitive in its features. It was not just her appearance that had changed, but her place in the world. Athena turned away without looking back. The decision was final. The temple would be purified, the priestess removed, and Medusa, now no longer devout, no longer protected, would be cast out of civilization, carrying in her gaze the weapon she had never asked to possess. Her exile was not announced with ceremony. There was no decree read out in the public square, only removal. Medusa was led away from the temple she had once called a refuge. Every step away from the city was an erasure. The priestess became a rumour. The rumour became a threat. The landscape she came to inhabit was arid, uneven, marked by rocks that looked like the earth's own exposed bones. There were no columns there, no altar, only biting wind and raw silence. It was the sort of place where even the echo refuses to linger. At first, she avoided looking directly at anything living. She walked with her face lowered, as if the ground might offer safe company. The serpents on her head did not sleep. They moved with constant restlessness, testing the air as if they accepted the new state better than she did. But the world does not forget a story that carries danger. Men began to appear, first curious, then ambitious, warriors drawn by the promise of glory. The creature that turned others to stone had become a challenge to be conquered. The first of them advanced with sword raised and blind confidence. He called her a monster before even seeing her fully. When his eyes met hers, the word died on his lips. His skin hardened, his movement froze, his body became an involuntary monument. Others came, some more cautious, some more arrogant, all believing they would be different. The ground around Medusa began to fill with interrupted human forms, faces caught in the final moment of shattered certainty. She did not celebrate. There was no triumph in surviving like this. Each statue was proof that the world saw her only as a threat. No one asked who she had been. Absolutely no one asked about what had transpired in the temple. They only came heavily armed with a singular intent. Over time, her figure ceased to be that of an exiled woman and became a solidified legend. They said her gaze was pure evil. They said she had been born deformed. They said the gods had made her that way to test heroes. The truth was gradually buried beneath more convenient versions. And then came the name that would change the final course of her story, Perseus. He was not just another adventurer, he was someone sent with a purpose. His mission was not out of curiosity, it was a task. Unlike the others, he would not walk straight to his death. He would come with divine guidance, because when the gods decide to bring a story to an end, they do not leave it to chance. They send a hero